Now, there's a related CSS property that I want to introduce to you here that relates to our float property. Think of these guys as brother and sister or cousins. These guys are definitely related. This property is called clear. And what he'll do is he'll force a floating element down to the next available space inside your document. Let's say, for instance, this is what I'm looking at. And this is exactly where I left off in the previous exercise. So I have my 4 divs. They're all floating to the left-hand side, but I've got this massive blue div, which is occupying all of the horizontal space, thus forcing the other 2 floating objects down to the next available line. Well, what if my layout called for this blue div to actually appear down on the next available line? In other words, I want them to float to the left, but I want to force them to start on the next available line. Well, that's where clear comes in. So give me a moment here. I'm going to flip back over to my code, and I'm going to go and look for my blue div. There he is right there. And I'm going to go and throw in this clear property. So I'm going to type in clear. Now, there's 3 different values that I can use for clear. I can use left, and what that means is it's going to move any content below any left floating objects, for instance, the div above it. Or I could say clear right, which would do the opposite. It would clear any floating objects that are floating on the right-hand side. And then the last value that I can use is called both. And this is the one that I usually use because oftentimes I might shift things from the left to the right, and then that means I have to go and change all my clears. So if I go both, then what that will do is that'll move content below left and right floating elements. Okay, so I'm going to go with both here, and then I'll save my document back to the browser. Now, we might get a slightly unexpected result here. Let's see what we get. I'm going to refresh, and this is what we wind up with. The yellow box appears where it originally sat. It's still floating to the left. Now, my wide blue div is forced down to the next available line, but then there's enough room over on the right-hand side to squeeze in the right box. So he's now accommodating that space, but there isn't enough room left there on the right-hand side to accommodate the width of the green box, so the green box is forced down to the next available line. Okay, so this is how clear is working. Think of clear as like a forced line break, okay? So here's another example. Maybe, for whatever reason, I want this red guy to appear way down where the green guy is, and I want the green guy to shift over to the right. So what I'd have to do is I'd have to put a clear property on the red div. So let's go and do that. Look for my red div, there he is right there, and then I'll go and throw in my clear. Clear, and then I always like to use both, unless I'm doing something specialized. There we go, something like that. Refresh, and again, what's happened here is the red box could occupy this space, but I've told it to start over on its own separate line. Okay, and then green is not clearing, so he's wrapping up right beside the red div. Okay, so float and clear, they work together. Again, they're related to one another. So you might want to experiment a little bit with your floats and your clears. And where things get really interesting is when you have more than 4 div elements. Maybe you have 8, or maybe you have 10. Maybe you have some kind of an image gallery or something like that, right? It's pretty cool stuff.